Which one? We got coil shock, we got air shock. I've been running both of these on this bike. There's so much torque, air versus coil. All the coil crew says, nah, coil all day, coil all day. And then trail ride crew, some of them run coil, some of them run air. A lot of the guys are, oh no, I prefer air because it's lighter and makes my bike feel more playful. Now, just speaking in terms of what makes your bike playful, setup is what makes your bike playful. Being in the right spring configuration, you can make an air shock feel terrible, dull, dead, rough, or you can make it feel super supple, super supportive, very much coil-like, very linear with the, especially when you start adding the MegNeg. But there's no denying that a coil is way better on the right bike in terms of consistency and never ever having to check your pressure or never ever having to worry about whether your bike's riding the way it should be riding. There's nothing worse than starting a ride, checking your pressure at 10 o'clock in the morning, and then it's going to be a hot day but it started off pretty cool and shady, and all of a sudden you're in the heat. It started at 20 degrees, you pump your bike up, set it up at 20 degrees Celsius, and all of a sudden it's 32 degrees when you're riding, and instead of your bike feeling super plush and super consistent how it always feels, with your air shock, forks feeling a little bit choppy, a little bit stiff, rear end's feeling like it's standing up and it's just wacky as. So what's happening is as the heat builds up, as the temperature of the day goes from 20 degrees to 30 degrees, the air pressure in the fork and the air pressure in your shock rise up. Coil, not an issue. Not an issue at all. Still an issue with the fork, obviously, because I always run an air fork. But with the coil on, it's always going to feel the same. It's always going to feel the same. So consistency, this thing is just head and shoulders. Absolutely head and shoulders above your any air setup you want. I don't care what you've done to the air, whether you run nitrogen or anything like that, it's still going to fluctuate. Nitrogen is more stable, they say, but it's still going to fluctuate. So, my preference is definitely a coil, but it's only great on certain bikes. So we'll get to progression. We talk about the leverage ratio of different bikes. Some bikes are quite linear, some are a little more progressive, some are extremely progressive. You take the YT for example, which has got a high progressivity rate. I don't know exactly the maths to work out the progression on each different bike. I did have it, I found it on the net, and I was working it out through the leverage because you got the starting leverage ratio and then kind of the ending leverage ratio. A lot of people give you, a lot of the manufacturers give you the leverage ratios and you can just work it out from there, from those numbers. But anyway, 11% this Patrol, so they say it doesn't work with a coil. It definitely works. It works killer. But I lose some of the cornering prowess, and it feels like the beginning of the stroke is a little stiff, the middle of the stroke starts to soften up a little bit, which is almost perfect, but the end of the stroke's a little softer again. Doesn't bottom out, but it doesn't seem to have the same carrying speed as I can get out of this. So climbing, this climbs better. I run a 475 spring, which puts me probably closer to 25% sag on this thing. With the air shock, I run it at about 28, 29, probably 29% sag for perfect handling. It gets in and out of everything really, really well. For whatever reason, it doesn't feel super efficient pedaling, but it's faster everywhere. As soon as I'm on a trail, it's faster everywhere. But with this, I never have to touch it. So it's almost as good, it's just not quite as fast against the clock. It's Moriata, for instance, I can get regularly 250s. I got a KOM there, it's 239. But if I'm going out there for just a quick slap, I can regularly get 250s with the air shock on. With the coil, I'm struggling to get around the 255 mark. So it just feels like it still motors everywhere, but it's just not as fast out of everything and over everything. The air shock just seems to, it's got this little pocket of right in the sag, just above and just below the sag. When I'm riding, it's got this pocket of absolute nothingness. It's just, so the idea that coil's more supple than air, no, my air shock's definitely more supple at speed when it's set up perfectly. Now the way I've got this set up is 2 positive tokens, 1 negative band. So quite a big negative air chamber, and then bringing the positive air chamber to suit. What I also like on this shot is 3 positive tokens, and because of the 3 positive tokens, if I was to leave it at 1 negative band, so we're kind of deviating a bit here, but 1 negative band, if I was to go 3 positive tokens, it makes the entire spring feel way too strong. So I've got a but I like the hammock that I get at the end of the travel. I like from the mid to the end of the travel. It gives me this real good something to push that it really slingshots me out of things. So it's a little bit better like that. It gives me a little bit more how you going out of there. Drops it a little deeper in the sag, so it corners a little bit better, but then you're kind of starting to bring pedal strikes and whatnot. But so if I go to 3 tokens and leave it with just the 1 negative band, it's too strong. So I want the 3 tokens, like I'm just saying. I want that hammock, I want that feel, but I need to soften up the spring prep. I need to soften up the overall spring. So I run another couple of bands. So 3 or 4 negative bands plus the 3 positive tokens gives me kind of the same strength as 1 negative band and 2 positive tokens gives me, but it changes the shape of the spring. And it brings it a little bit better. Definitely better for steeper trails. If I'm just riding steep trails all day or bike parky style trails, I'd definitely go the 3 and 3 or 3 and 4 positives. 3 negs and 3 positives and 4 negatives. So I've got way more tuning options with the AirShot. I can change the configuration completely to suit exactly what I'm looking for within the confines of an 11% progression bike. The shock, the coil shock. Like I said, 11%, I'm a little higher in the sag in order for the bike to feel efficient enough. Now if I go to this is a 475 spring. If I go to a 450 spring, it gives me a softer initial rate, so I'm lower in the travel, but it just doesn't carry any speed anywhere, so it's not a race bike. It corners killer, it's got the perfect cornering position, kind of bottoms out pretty hard. People have said you should try a progressive spring. I'm not going to throw any more money away trying to get the spring rates right, because I don't have any faith in the spring rates being consistent. I don't have any faith in the 450 plus that MRP, for instance, provides as a dual rate spring or a progressive spring. I don't have any faith that the 450 at the start of that spring is the equivalent to the 450 Fox spring, because RockShox isn't equivalent to Fox's 450. There's kind of almost 25 to 50 pounds difference for the same, like actual weight bearing difference for the same what they've got stamped on their springs. So I'm not into that. Spring manufacturers, definitely get your stuff together and make sure you're all consistent, and make sure you're all measuring consistently, because you've got numbers there. It should be maths. It should be 500 pounds per inch of compression. It takes 500 pounds to compress that spring by an inch. It should be simple. Anyway, digress, wasting time and effort there. 450, it's just slow. It's just slow. It's corners better, but it's just slow. So I compromise with that higher ride height, so it doesn't corner as well. I've got to put more effort into making corners instead of the bike. This thing, at the right sag, it just absolutely eats them alive, eats corners alive. But when I go to the coil, it eats everything alive. I have to focus a little more on the cornering. It climbs better. It's more efficient on the street because of that firmer initial spring rate. I just like it. I love the fact that I never have to check the air. To be honest, that's the biggest thing. I never ever have to check the air. It's not that it's more supple or smoother over the bumps. It's not. It's no real difference. Saying that, this isn't a high-end shock. This is my Zocchi Bomber CR, and I had this change, so it comes out with a mid tune. I had the compression tune set to a low tune, because when I first put it on, and I had the Cascade link, and this is another thing, when I had the Cascade link, the Cascade takes this bike to 24%. Now, with the Cascade, it just felt too, it still did feel like 24% was a little too much progression. So too much progression will give you that bucking feeling off of the lip of jump, bucking feeling through rough rock gardens, where it's not too fast to rebound. It's a notable coming out of the end of the travel, bucking. And you really, if you've got a shock like an X2, a float X2 or a DHX2 where you can dial in the high speed rebound and really slow that down to catch some of that load out of the end of the travel, then you can counter it with a bike with 25 to 30% progression. But to me, that's too progressive. The Cascade Link was a little bit too progressive. A lot of guys would like it still. I'm not saying it's prohibitively progressive, but it's at the top end for sure. So I tested this with the standard tune, so the shock kind of felt rubbish anyway. So it didn't get the justice it deserved. It didn't get the full test it deserved. But all the same, my conclusion with should you get a coil shock or should you get an air shock, if your bike if you can find the progressivity or the progression of your bike to be 15% to 20% or even to 25%, then you're right in the wheelhouse of a coil. 15% up, you're right in the wheelhouse of a coil. I think 15% works absolutely perfect for a coil. It'll give you the exact perfect ride height where you're not too deep in the sag, where you're pedal striking everywhere. You're not too high in the sag where your cornering will be suffering. You'll be right on the good handling and good speed carrying sag where you can still... I think once you go deeper than 30% sag, you're starting to have to use too little of the amount, so 35%, 35 especially, using too little of the spring, so you're already 35% into the spring before you start taking hits. I think you're leaving too little of the spring left. When you go up to 30 and even 25, you're giving way more spring to catch bumps, so you don't have to run that spring so progressive. So a coil with a progressive frame, you could run that right on 30% and it'll give you the perfect ramp up, the perfect speed carrying, the perfect pedaling efficiency, the perfect cornering. It'll be everything. 15 to 20% I think is my sweet spot number. So if your bike is either lacking progressivity and the guys at Cascade Components have a link to increase your progressivity and you really want to go a coil, or you're running a coil and you don't like to have the bike handles, definitely go to Cascade Link. And definitely run a coil. But if your bike's only a 6 or 7, like the Transition Sentinel, 7% progressivity, you have to run it way too high in the sag for it to not be bottoming out and for it to feel like it carries speed. So you definitely want a bike with, like I said, 11 works. This is 11 and it works fine. It works enough for me to have been happy to leave the coil on for so long. But for 11 and less, definitely an air shock. And definitely, if you're going to go a Super Lux or you have a Super Lux, my thoughts on the Super Lux is the negative chambers from standard is too small. And it also has some other stuff taking up space in it. Now, don't try this at home. I don't care if you do or not. But I've taken the countermeasure spring out. So it's basically another 2 negative bands. So I've basically got 1 negative band in there, so almost completely as large as it can go, plus I've taken this out of the negative side of the air chamber. So definitely don't do that. But I don't think I really don't think it changes it at all. The shock doesn't feel any different. And I think this is only really for stopping harsh bottom outs or top outs before you've equalised the spring properly. So if you pump the spring up and it tops out because the negative chamber hasn't got enough pressure in it. So as long as you equalise right, I don't think that's super necessary. Air shock works killer. If you've got a Super Lux, get a MegNeg and tune it to however you like. Like I was saying at the start of the video about making the spring stronger or taking away strength with the negative bands. So if you want a stronger overall spring, less negative band. Less negative bands. If you want a weaker overall spring but still stronger than the standard non-MegNeg spring, then load it up. Load it up with the negative bands, and then just tune your positive to suit. And don't get too carried away with, oh, should I do 2 or 3 or 4 negative bands? Just set it at 2 or set it at 4 and leave it and just work on the positives. So minimise the amount of factors that you're changing, and I guarantee you'll find a killer setup even with all 4 negative bands in that MegNeg. You won't even worry about it. You'll probably end up with 3 tokens, or depending on the progression of your bike. But That's the long and short of it. I love the coil. I'm definitely going back to the coil. I do not care at all about weight. Weight is for people with weak legs. If you're worried about weight, your legs are a little weak, or your heart's a little weak, or your lungs are a little weak, which it's not everybody, you know, some of us are older, or physical ailments, or whatever it is. For me, weight's not a big issue. If weight's an issue for you, definitely stick to the air. But if you want consistency and never, ever, ever having to worry about your shock, or whether the pressure's right, or whether it's gone up or down, or leaked or anything, all day. Coil with a light spring, so I usually run the SLS, the super light steel from Fox. And honestly, the bike doesn't feel much heavier. This thing, you'll fall over when I tell you, but I've got cush core in the back, I've got a lighter thing in the front, rim protection in the front, a Fedo Mariposa, and DH compound at the back, and with the coil on it, it weighs just a hair under 17 kilos. And I don't care, I ride all day, I'll out climb people, it's no worries. So don't really worry about the weight, worry about the consistency and the performance. And if you buy a high quality coil, you can tune it exactly how you want. You can tune it how you want, outside of the actual spring rate. You can kind of counter for things with your high speed rebound and high speed compression, low speed compression. So it's not an issue. I love the coil, but I also love the air. And like I said, this bike's faster with air. It is. But I have to have it right, because if I get 2 or 3 psi wrong, it feels like garbage. Or maybe that's probably an exaggeration. 5 psi feels like garbage. If it's 5 psi too soft, it's rubbish. If it's 5 psi too firm, it's definitely rubbish. So you've got to be spot on. And that 5 psi will change with the temperature. So something to think about, but all day with the coil. So my next bike's definitely going to be coil compatible. Stay tuned, because it's not far away.